There would be fewer wars without religion is a claim that has been widely repeated more and more in light of recent world events. It's one that finds a lot of traction in everyday conversation, especially in the 21st century Western world, where adherence to organised religion moves more and more to the peripheries of society. I'm going to argue that this inherently historical claim doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and is in fact a product of an incredibly narrow perspective that's indicative of generalization, uncritical thinking, and the self-centered navel-gazing that characterizes so much of modern discourse. Of course, this is just my opinion from a historical perspective, and there are doubtless others of which I'm not aware. I hope that even if you disagree, you might hear some valid points which you might not have considered before. Additionally, this video is not meant at all as a comment on a particular contemporary issue. I will be speaking in general terms, looking to address a perspective that most commonly finds its footing in pub conversations, people's kitchens, or social media comments sections. In other words, the layman's view. So, would there be fewer wars without religion? First and foremost, this assertion necessarily carries with it an implicit better alternative. By saying there would be less conflict without religion, you're necessarily imagining that godless world, and I would argue tacitly suggesting that such an alternative reality could or should exist. Human spirituality, belief in the supernatural, and the congregation of societies around such beliefs are deeply embedded in our subconscious. They're older than written language, and are a commonality of almost every single human society. Broadly speaking, the act of attempting to identify and engage with higher powers is a natural part of us, and has developed and evolved alongside our species. It's not just something that can be discarded. This suggestion is a product of a particularly myopic 21st century view, one with which I'm intimately familiar as a result of British state schooling. Of course, in an irreligious time in society, religious affiliation can seem arbitrary, with the possibility of picking and choosing faith as you please being a product of being presented with a selection of them as coexistent equivalents. To millions, if not billions of people around the world, this is definitely not the case. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is another issue altogether. There's another implicit assumption in the initial statement that there would be fewer wars without religion. Which religion? There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different faiths and beliefs, with different structures and practices. The word religion comes from the Latin religio, which refers specifically to obligation or duty, and later to institutional or state religion in the Roman Empire. So not only organized spiritual faith, but that along the lines of state power. Organized religion on a national or imperial scale. So then, we can take that the original statement is broadly intended to apply to the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But lack of specificity doesn't invalidate the actual argument. I find it strange that in such an irreligious age where people tend to have an acute sense of material motivations and a suspicion of altruistic stated intent, the idea that there would be fewer wars without religion holds so much traction. This is because religion is often simply a vector or additional justification for conflict, which originates along the lines of more immediate and material concerns. This isn't to say genuine religious belief does not underpin a great deal of violent action, but when it comes to war, mobilizing entire societies against one another, an appeal to the metaphysical, I would assert, is just not enough. The first historical event that comes to mind when the concept of religious conflict is discussed is the Crusades. The First Crusade was a holy war declared by Pope Urban II in 1095 AD. Nominally, the justification for a war to cleanse the East and take the holy city of Jerusalem was a response to the waning power of the Byzantine Empire and the threat that the Islamic Empire posed to the freedom of Christian pilgrims. However, the Crusade, despite all its ostensible religiousness, provides us with a prime example of faith being a pretext for ulterior motives. Of the 5 extant versions of Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont, at which he made his rallying call for a crusade, all of them strongly stress his desire for peace in Europe, just as strongly as his desire for the protection of the Eastern Christians. This is an oblique reference to a church movement of the early Middle Ages, the peace of God. For years in Western Europe, there had been intense famine, epidemic, and economic hardship. There was rife instability and extreme violence, which radically changed the structure of society. The military aristocracy of the Empire of Charlemagne had no more wars to fight, no more eastwards expansion to provide plunder and land. And with the introduction of primogeniture, or the practice of the firstborn son inheriting all the property of the father, a great many young noblemen were now left aimless and without property. Either they joined the priesthood if they were educated, or they became milites, roving warriors which made their living through looting and plundering the countryside. Naturally, this badly affected the tithes which the rural population was able to pay the church. The peace of God was a movement led by the church which encouraged these warriors to take up their arms only against non-Christians, not to threaten the innocent and to live by a biblical code of ethics. This was the creation of a new institution, the Christian Knight. Though the peace of God curbed violence in the short term, the church understood that the listless mass of dedicated warriors it had just pacified couldn't be kept on a tight leash forever. An outlet for their violence, far from their homelands, and sanctioned by the church itself, was the perfect solution. The call for a crusade to the Holy Land was ridding Europe of a large number of what were once called bandits, nuisances, and thugs, but were now soldiers of God. This additionally provides an explanation for the absolute brutality with which the First Crusade descended upon the Middle East, even by the standards of the day. Europe was not sending a coherent, organised army of professionals, it was sending the dregs of its society, who'd made their living from looting and pillaging. It's clear then that even what we would most obviously interpret as religious conflicts require far more than just religion to set societies on the road to violence. If religion was not an easy-to-reach additional justification for conflict, another would quickly and easily be found. This can be seen with the totalitarian political ideologies of the 20th century, all-encompassing frameworks of ideas which purport to be able to explain all of history and human nature, in a sense, modern religions. The socio-economic roots of conflict, which every war has at its heart, are always there, no matter the window dressing of the high-minded principles which are assigned to it. The fact that totalitarian ideology and religions can both be used as masks to the same endpoint shows another simple fact of human society, that positions of power can and will attract the worst of humanity, whether that be the office of a cardinal or pope in the medieval era, a general or merchant in the early modern period, or a politician today. Where there's power to be found, those who desire power will gravitate towards it, no matter what purpose the rank in question nominally serves. With this in mind, it seems unfair to blame the very concept of organised religion for conflicts started by popes, when if they'd been born in another era, those same men might well have been sitting in the representative chamber of a modern democracy, with not a hint of religiosity about them. And this, I feel, is the tenuous concept at the root of the perception that religion is a lead cause of conflict, that organised religion is an evil, plain and simple. Of course, without difficulty, anybody can point to a conflict, act, or policy instituted by a religious body which has done harm. But I would argue that equally one could do the same with any nation-state on earth, which are far more specific, exclusive, and closely organised identities than any of the major religions. Do we condemn the German language, or the concept of Germany, for the crimes committed by its government in the early half of the 20th century? I don't think so. Ask a modern Western person their opinion on Germany, and it's very likely to be a positive one. It's a country that's given the world fantastic artists, musicians, scientists, and philosophers, and it's rightly credited for that. Yet, organised religion is not afforded the same mercy. Its flaws and crimes are evident. But why do we not often enough praise what achievement it represents? In Europe's darkest age, it was the church that continued the transmission of literature and education. In the Renaissance, it was the church that commissioned some of humanity's most wondrous artworks. And all over the world, the works of architecture which are the most soaring and triumphant, and most often are considered by their country's populations to represent their national spirits, are religious ones. And aside from their physical artifacts, The greatest legacy of the faiths of the world is often their actions. Kindness, charity, and duty, which help poor and vulnerable people worldwide. And beyond simply physical acts of good, a particular example of the positive power of religion that springs to mind is the pilgrimage of Pope John Paul II to Poland in 1979, when it was under communist rule. In what is even now a deeply Christian country, effectively occupied by a foreign power which ordered the practice of state atheism, millions of people flooded Warsaw to pray alongside one of their own countrymen, now the head of the Catholic Church. This was an extremely powerful moment, and served as a crucible to strengthen Polish national feeling, which over the next 10 years would culminate in the Solidarity movement and the fall of the Iron Curtain across Europe. In summary, I'd caution against characterizing religion as destructive or a force in the way of progress. Perhaps for us, in the 21st century, where we are afforded the luxury of freedom of choice and forgiven a lack of perspective, organised religions seem to us a little silly and archaic, something that we might want to just leave behind us. And a lot of the time, that point of view is completely fair. But I would argue that they are something we can never leave behind, something innate to us, and ultimately something that throughout history has been a central and inextricable driver in the development of a modern, educated, mostly peaceful civilization.